The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, Fleer, and more. Hi, Chris McClune here with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this episode of our podcast. I guess today we're going to be talking a little bit about water delivery again. With me today is Jonathan Brumley. He's a lieutenant with the Denver, Colorado Fire Department. And you may remember him from a month or so ago. He did a webcast for us on large handlines as well. Got really, really deep into it in the webcast. So that is available, it's archived. But today I wanted to, that's more of a presentation, followed by Q&A. Today what I wanted to do was talk a little bit, and we'll have more of a conversation with Jonathan about larger hand lines. I'm dating myself here, but, 30 years ago, when I started in the fire service, pretty much our trucks carried, they still had two booster lines on them. But, it was 1 3/4, 2.5. Then we went up to 3 and 5. Some companies had 4. If you were getting into the 6 or greater, you were really on the industrial side of the business back then. Really there weren't a lot of intermediate sizes. And that's what I was going to talk to Jonathan about today. We're going to talk a bit about those larger hand lines. And so, Jonathan, I guess first of all, introduce yourself to the group. You might want to talk about Denver, maybe some of the different sizes of hand lines you carry there. But after you do that, could you just give a brief background on what is available today in terms of larger hand lines, and then we'll get a little bit more into the weeds. So introduce yourself, and then talk a little bit about what's available to us today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you mentioned, my name is Jonathan. I've been on the Denver Fire Department for about 4.5 years now. Prior to that, I worked in Houston, Texas for the Houston Fire Department, and spent some time before that as a volunteer and working for a couple of smaller agencies as well along the way. So pretty diverse background when it comes to engine company operations, size of departments, staffing models, things like that. And so, yeah, there's a pretty wide variance when it comes to things like tactics, and it comes to purchasing, all of these little intricate things that come together to make a fire department. But I think, like you mentioned, there are some commonalities there where the American Fire Service really did have 1 3/4, 2.5, maybe some 3-inch, and then some type of large diameter supply. And I would venture to say that the majority of fire departments in the country still have that on their apparatus right now. And that's what has been my experience over the last almost 15 years in the fire service, is that a lot of fire departments already have these hose line sizes on their apparatus. And it's just how they're using them that varies, really. And so let's talk a little bit about what's available, and we can talk a little bit about what we have in my fire department specifically. So at this point, we have quite a few hand line sizes that I would consider a large or medium diameter attack line. And I would classify those everything from 2-inch up to and below 3-inch. 3-inch, I'm not considering an attack line at all. It is oversized for the interior environment. It is oversized when it comes to being able to staff these things. It is just so heavy that it's not a mobile option. So anything below that, I would consider a large hand line. But we obviously have smaller hand lines that do their jobs and have their place as well. So really within that range of 2-inch to just below 3-inch, there are a plethora of options these days. And we have, every manufacturer having roughly a smaller internal diameter on their hose line sizes. So because we have multiple manufacturers involved in this and we have multiple product lines, you also see a variance in what the actual size of that hose line is. But when you go to their catalog, it's typically classified as either 2-inch or 2.5, even though we have essentially 12 plus hose sizes that fall in those two categories. And it's really just a conversation with the manufacturers as to what it actually ends up being. And things get even more muddied these days because you might go to one manufacturer who will say, yes, our internal diameter of our hose line is, let's say, 2.05 inches when we flow 50 PSI. However, if you were to put 100 PSI nozzle on this, it expands and it's now going to be something like 2.15 or something like that. And these numbers are a little bit ambiguous. Talk to your manufacturer so that you know exactly. But we should be asking these questions prior to making our purchasing decisions, because it's not just as simple as, hey, the 2-inch will always do this, the 2.5 will always do that. And one thing that's exciting to the fire service these days, and I think will be used more and more often, is now we have 2.25-inch hose size being introduced to the market from a couple of different manufacturers who fall roughly in the range of 2.25. And what's exciting about that is it maintains the target flow that a lot of us have traditionally used on our 2.5, somewhere around 250 to 265 gallons per minute. But we see a significant reduction in the overall weight of our attack packages. And so it becomes a much more mobile option. And so for those departments who are considering things like staffing, considering things like what is my overall target hazards, they're able to accomplish a lot of work with this new hose line size and not beat up their personnel in the process of doing that.
That's actually one of the questions I was going to get into was the maneuverability of these lines. So we're because you brought it up, I'm going to jump around a little bit in that list that we talked about. But how maneuverable are the larger hand lines? Are these 2 firefighter lines? I mean, like at the nozzle. I'm not talking about all as around corners and up, and upstairs, and having other people on that line assisting with the feed. But when you're at the fire, or when you're getting close to it, are these pretty maneuverable lines? I mean, again, I've got 1 3/4 in my head. So like, are these not necessarily getting to the 2.5, because I think we all know some of the challenges with stretching that and using it as a hand line. But these other ones, the 2-inch, the 2.25, those types of lines, are they pretty maneuverable?
They're absolutely maneuverable, and they're absolutely manageable with one firefighter up on the nozzle. It's not a situation where we're having to take an entire company and stack them all together at that nozzle just to hold onto these hand lines. I say that with the caveat of using proper technique and properly speccing your attack package. And one of the biggest things that we can do is consider both our target flows and the pressure that we're pumping these lines at. And historically, we've had issues with having very grossly over pumped hand lines. And in a lot of cases, we are using nozzles that require a nozzle pressure that's not giving us the benefits that we once thought that it was. So many of these bigger hose line sizes are very robust in their construction, and they are capable of resisting kinks at these lower pressures. And so we're seeing huge benefits when we're using nozzles spec'd to pump at 50 PSI or 75 PSI at the tip. And what that does is it gives us the high volumes, but we're not seeing the same amount of work that maybe a combination nozzle pumped at 100 PSI was putting on those firefighters. We're seeing significant reductions in the amount of nozzle reaction. Therefore, we can put a single firefighter on the end of that line and confidently expect them to flow these things. And, you mentioned that we don't have to necessarily get into the conversation of maneuverability through the structure. But if we're spacing our individuals the way that technique would say is beneficial to us, then when we do introduce things like obstacles, corners, bends, all of these things, it still remains maneuverable, and we can spread out our manpower so that our nozzle and our backup firefighters, whoever that might be, whether that's an officer or additional firefighters, are able to maneuver around those obstacles while the nozzle firefighter is still able to hold on to that nozzle, keep the line open, and apply water where it actually needs to go. Because with these higher target flows, let's say between, anywhere from 225 gallons a minute all the way up to 300 gallons per minute, a single firefighter is capable of handling those flows with technique. But it doesn't do a lot of good for us if they're not putting it in the right place. And so if we can, really dial in those techniques, then we can kind of focus less on how do I hold this thing and more on, am I putting this 250 gallons per minute where it's actually going to be effective on the fire ground? Because 300 gallons per minute sprayed into the floor or sprayed straight into the wall in front of me, not impacting the seat of the fire, isn't going to do any good anyways. We're all just working hard for no reason. But these lines are definitely not a situation where, we have to consider multiple companies all stacked up at the nozzle to hold on to these things. And that was my first experience in the fire service with some of these lines. And it goes back to how the lines were pumped, the tip pressure, all of those things. But, now understanding a little bit more what a tack package design actually ends up doing to the nozzle firefighter, I'm much more comfortable with it, and I'm very comfortable putting even newer firefighters on the end of that line and feeling pretty confident that they'll be able to handle these hose lines, even at those higher target flows.
It's interesting you brought that up because we're in our November issue, the print issue of Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment, and that'll eventually be on our website as well. But we have a column called FA Viewpoints, and the question that I posed to our two columnists for that, one is Bill Adams and one is Ricky Riley, both members of our advisory board, was about 2-inch line. And I'm not going to give all of it away, but Ricky Riley mentioned that his experience was also, first he mentioned that, it's not, although maybe right now these other sizes seem new to us, they were actually doing them a number of years ago.
Absolutely.
At times. But he said that his experience early on was that they were being overpumped. That was something that he mentioned as well. And he always mentions, no matter what the question is, for these Viewpoints articles, about training and making sure that you are training on these things, because it's not going to nothing else will matter if you are not deploying properly, stretching properly, and doing everything that you just mentioned. So just interesting how it all sort of comes together,
It is, yeah. And here I'll give a shout out to a guy that many people will know, Dennis Laguerre. And he has been a huge driving force in actually diving into the nuts and bolts on hose line sizes. And even prior to 2017, going back to like 2016, one particular manufacturer began testing a hose line size that was actually a true diameter, where if you said this was a 2.5-inch hand line, this actually came to you as the end user as a 2.5-inch hand line. And through a lot of his research, we now have additional hand line sizes true to their diameters. So what the hose size says it actually is. These aren't new at all. And what he found is, even going back a century, we have fire department documentation talking about 2-inch lines, 2.25-inch lines, and 2.5 lines. So while this may seem new, to the American Fire Service, these were traditional hand line sizes that just have kind of gotten modified, lost in the mix. And a lot of that comes down to our conversations with manufacturers about things like friction loss, where we say, hey, we've got this 2.5-inch line, but wow, its friction loss numbers are really high. They would potentially come back to us with a little bit different construction, better friction loss numbers. But in the reality, what happened is we started getting this creep where the actual hose line sizes were getting larger and larger and larger. So it would be marketed as a 2.5, but we might end up with a hose line size that is 2.7 inches in internal diameter. And yeah, it had some great benefits to us as the end user. Yes, we have a hose line size with very good friction loss numbers, not even realizing though that what mechanics and what physics it took to get us to that point. But these hose lines have been around for centuries. And there's a reason why things like 2-inch, 2.25, 2.5 target flows of, 185, 250, 265, why these exist. And they all go to things that our predecessors have learned long before us. And we're just kind of continuing that information because these are best practices, and they've been proven to work over centuries.
So we talked a bit about, what's out there. It's been out there for a long time, but not everybody, like you said, a lot of times there's still just that set, the inch and 3/4, 2.5, 3. So discuss some of the reasons departments should consider some of the larger hand lines. It's been, the question that I had posed in that viewpoints was, should, departments, just full bore, full scale, go to 2-inch attack line, as their primary attack line. Again, I'm not going to give it all away. There were a couple of different answers there, but from your perspective, discuss some of the reasons departments should be considering the potential of equipping their rigs with some larger hand lines.
Yeah. So first and foremost, biggest reason is it's probably already on your apparatus. And it takes very little in terms of purchasing. We're not talking about wholesale changes. It's in most of our fire stations today. And the reality is we should know and be able to function with each of the pieces of equipment that we decide to put on our apparatus. And so with that being understood that it's on there, our predecessors understood that there was a reason that it was on there. Let's understand why we can use it today and how versatile these things are. So traditionally, the bigger hose line sizes were great because they serve some supply function as well as some attack function. And now with the addition of things like LDH, 3-inch hose, those should be more of our supply side operations. And especially because our pumps and our apparatus is just capable of moving such significant volumes of water. We can allow those bigger hand lines to do their jobs while we allow attack lines to be attack lines. With that being said, we go to many more fires than just involvement of 1 to, let's say, 3 bedrooms on fire. Right, that's going to continue to be the bread and butter for especially the American Fire Service, and our smaller attack lines are very capable of doing that. However, we need to be able to escalate our operations when we encounter fire situations that go well beyond that. And it's not just as simple as just pull, multiple 1 3/4 lines, because the fact is when these fires grow exponentially, especially in large volume compartments, we're just not able to get the knockdown, and we're not going to be able to get the penetration of our water into those environments when we're talking about large volumes of space, especially high heat environments. The two lines operate very differently. And one of the best examples that I was given of that is if you had 2 balls, let's say one is a tennis ball, one is a bowling ball, both set out at 50 PSI out of the nozzle, set through a high heat environment, traveling the same speed, which one would we expect to reach the back wall? Eventually, that high heat is just going to deteriorate. And we know that all things being equal, aside from the mass of one ball versus the other, the ball with the smaller mass will always deteriorate faster. And that's what's happening with our large streams, is it is staying more compact. It's not getting caught up in thermal columns, and it's not getting evaporated en route to the seat of the fire where we actually need our water to do the work. And so we can go out into a parking lot and we can flow the 2 lines, and they might look similar when we're missing that element of heat. But when we add back in that ultra heated environment that we're going to encounter at ceiling levels, we need a stream that's capable of actually reaching what's on fire and not just cooling gases along the way, because there's a lot more to fire attack than just what's in our immediate environment. We want to have a long distance relationship with our streams and be able to, get some knockdown power from a distance before we actually commit to this space where we may or may not have enough volume to, impact the fires that we're going to. So absolutely, we need to have the ability to escalate our operations, and having big lines on our rig is fantastic, but having the ability to use those hand lines and be confident with them is even better.
Talk about some specific applications for these. Now, we talked about, the reasons why, and you talked about those 3 or 4 rooms on fire type of calls, but could you get more? Because, these are not only there for some of the things that you just mentioned, but there are specific tactical decisions where you would, like the larger hand line is going to be the choice. So could you talk about just some specific applications for using these larger hand lines?
Yeah, specific applications are just going to be scenarios where we show up and we can guarantee that we're behind the eight ball already. For whatever reason, fire has grown exponentially before we've gotten there even. And we know that we've got to do a lot of work before we can kind of gain traction on these things. Situations where it's just going to take large volumes of water to accomplish what we're there to do, and that's to protect life and property. That could be any number of buildings. That could be commercial. That could be residential. And it's really just dependent on the volume of fire that we encounter there. Specifically, buildings that we don't have the ability to compartmentalize are other scenarios where we really need to be thinking about larger hand lines. It's no problem if we can go to a bedroom that's 10 feet by 12 feet, close the door, and allow our, smaller streams to knock that down once we have lines in place. But when we're talking about these buildings that have just massive rooms, sometimes up to 2,000 or more square feet of space that we just cannot close off, that's a significant amount of fuel. That's a significant amount of oxygen that this fire has readily available. And we've got to have lines capable of meeting those situations as well. And then other situations that I can think of is just anything where we're dealing with a problem with friction loss, where friction loss is the main concern. So scenarios that might come into play are really long stretches, times where we might be going 500-600 feet away from our apparatus. Another situation might be when we're using building systems as our fire pump. We can't just assume that they'll give us endless amounts of pressure and we don't have this massive, fire apparatus outside supporting that fire attack. We've got to have big lines incorporated in our attack system to overcome those friction loss concerns that we have as well.
You mentioned friction loss. A big part of a pump operator's job is to know what the friction loss is going to be and compensate for it. What are some of the other things that pump operators need to be aware of when they're pumping these larger lines?
Yeah, so we got to be aware of the fact that this isn't a scenario where we're going to bake at 350 and pump at 150. Because if we're pumping our bigger lines at the same pressures that we're pumping our, smaller diameter attack lines, there's going to be a significant consequence to whoever's opening up that nozzle. Reason being is because we have such phenomenal friction loss benefits in using our bigger lines, it requires significantly less pressure in order to achieve the flows that we're looking for. So where a crosslay, for instance, might take 110 to 125 PSI, a properly pumped large attack line might be more in the realm of 70 to 80 PSI. So if all we do is pull the lever and we pump them the exact same way, all of a sudden we are crushing the people who are on the end of the line. And very few people will be able to keep that open for any period of time. And a closed nozzle isn't going to flow any GPM whatsoever. And that's what's going to happen whenever we overpump our lines by 50, 60 PSI. So absolutely, we have to be able to know what our particular attack package is rated for in terms of flows. That means getting out flow meters. That means getting out pitot gauges so that we know exactly what we have on our apparatus and so that we're dialing in our GPM properly. One thing that I will say is when we properly pump hand lines, guys are often surprised by how easy it is to maneuver the hand line. They feel like they have to be crushed by these larger hand lines in order for the line to actually be flowing what it's rated to, when the reality is very often you can pump a line at 250 gallons per minute and it's not going to be this scenario where guys are feeling overwhelmed immediately. So get out the pieces and the tools that we have available to us in our flow meters, in our pitot gauges, and put them to the test with what you have. And I think you'll be thoroughly surprised by how good some of these hand lines feel when we're pairing a target flow correctly with the diameter of hose line that we've chosen.
I wanted to talk a little bit about fire apparatus design. I mentioned Bill Adams before, and one of his pet peeves is making sure that you size size the hose bed that you're going to lay the hose in properly so that it will fit, across the bottom. So that's the kind of thing that I'm getting at. Often, you might have an 1.75 line, but when it lays flat, it's actually a different size. So talk
Right.
about some of the apparatus design impacts that you have when you start to go about specifying these larger hand lines.
Yeah, yeah. So this is kind of anecdotal and it's kind of just my own kind of preference, but I feel like I've had the most success in deploying attack lines that either come out of a single wide or a double wide bed for attack lines. So when you get into a scenario of going 3-4 wide, it starts to complicate. How do we get hose out of the bed? How do I get it onto my shoulder so that I'm not having to drag significant amount of hose or take multiple stacks off the top of multiple hose bed sections and try to build my own, shoulder loads or put it in the crook of my arm. So single wide and double wide are definitely my preference on that. And so with that being said, I want at least 100 feet of hose stacked in a way that makes it really easy to deploy. So if we were to consider, let's say, a 2.5 inch hand line, I'm going to want about 4.5 inches wide in my hose bed dedicated specifically for my larger line. Now, if we were to go double stack, let's double that. So about 9 inches of my tailboard dedicated to my larger hand line. And so we mentioned earlier what we might have in my particular fire department. And in my fire department, we do have 2-inch hose. We have multiple sizes of what's considered 2.5 hose, depending on the year that they were purchased and the manufacturer that we're using as well. So we have on most of our fire apparatus at least 600 feet of static loaded 2.5. And so looking at our divider, it is about 9 inches wide across and then at least 20 inches tall in order to accommodate 600 feet. So when we think about that, we're really not talking about a significant amount of space on that rear hose bed in order to do that. So I think that we need to consider the fact that when it comes to attack lines, we should put more thought into where it's coming off of. For a long time, many fire departments have been really just comfortable with all supply hose comes off of the rear and any attack hose is probably going to come out of a speed lay or a cross lay. And I think that pigeonholes us in a lot of ways. And I like having options available to you because of things like tight alleys, cars parked, things like ditches right on the side of the road. Those things can all impact our ability to get hose out of one place or another. And I mean, there's repercussions to a rear hose bed too, especially if we're stacking multiple right up at the seat of the fire. A truck company parking right at your tailboard can be damaging to a stretch as well. However, it's a lot easier to overcome that than, parking right behind a ladder truck and them not being able to unbed ladders. However, with that being understood, we can be creative in how we're laying out our hose beds. And I think what we're seeing in a lot of builds these days is a move to lower the hose bed height. And I think that that's fantastic. A lot more thought is being put into how do we get back to the core goals of an engine company, and the core goal of an engine company should be putting out fire. And for a long time, we started getting into speccing out things like rescue pumpers and compartments, taking up the majority of the room in a fire apparatus. And so what happens then is we only have room for our large diameter hose for supply, and individuals are climbing ladders and multiple steps to even touch hose on the back of their hose bed. And all of those things slow down the fire attack. And we've kind of lost focus on what the true goal of an engine company is when we're doing things like that. So it doesn't mean to say that an engine company can't have things like extrication tools on their hose and not have a shorter hose bed. I've seen a lot of different creative options for making that work. Things like battery powered tools these days do a lot for compartment space where we don't have to worry about a whole power plant to run that. I've seen engine companies where they've mounted tools in the front bumper so that they could lower their hose bed height. And probably one of the biggest things that you could do is doing L-shaped tanks so that we can lower that hose bed height and make attack lines the primary focus of our engine spec, because that's what's actually going to accomplish fire attack for our fire service. So a lot of focus should be put on that. And so it might mean deleting things like crosslays to make more space. It might mean moving a hose reel rather than right off of the tailboard where it's most convenient, to maybe put that up high, because the times that we're going to use that are probably going to be for our lower acuity fires, like your trash fires, your grass fires, things like that. So be creative and be willing to think about what is our primary mission as an engine company when we lay these things out. So another thing that we do on the Denver Fire Department is we have a hose load off of our front bumper. We have 200 feet of 2.5 preloaded, just accordioned back and forth, ready to go. And where that's very helpful is those tight alleys. Other places that really works well is going to be in your cul-de-sacs, where you're already nosed into the cul-de-sac. We're not trying to whip around to get our tailboard in line with the fire. We could just pull right off of that front bumper and still leave room for other apparatus. So be creative, look at other engine specs when you go to do your own in the future, and see what other fire departments, similar size to you, similar staffing models, and obviously similar response territory are doing and are working well for them as well.
That 2.5 on the bumper, that is pre-connected somehow?
Yeah, that one. So we do pre-connect our line 200 feet, and then we also stack an 1.75 bundle on top of that for those situations where we don't necessarily need the 2.5 flows, but we need the 2.5 friction loss benefits, or we are just looking for some additional maneuverability where we don't have to take it off of a crosslay and wrap around the fire engine, or come even worse, off of a tailboard backwards only to go forwards with it. So doing things like that, it helps out your different stretch scenarios as well, depending on where it's most efficient for you to park that apparatus.
Any need to tweak the booster tanks at all on these when you're thinking about going like with a larger hand line to start? And staying with some of that apparatus design stuff, is there a need to increase the capacity of those tanks?
So we're talking about increasing the overall gallons that we're carrying on the apparatus. So absolutely not. And so a urban fire department that has 300 feet hydrant spacing, running 500 gallons, should operate no differently with their large hand lines than they do with their small hand lines in terms of tank size. Furthermore, companies that are using 750 gallon tanks or 1,000 gallon tanks, those are going to be sufficient for big line operations as well. So yes, an apparatus driver needs to be more cognizant of water usage when it comes to fire attack. However, if we think about it in terms of how we're actually breaking down our water usage, a 250 gallon per minute nozzle is going to give us about 2 minutes of continuous flow with a 500 gallon tank, 3 minutes of continuous flow with a 750 gallon tank, and upwards of 4 minutes of continuous flowing with a 1,000 gallon tank. So if you think about this in terms of fireground tempo and fireground speed, the amount of time that we're actually flowing is pretty minimal in many situations. We're seeing very dramatic differences in the size of fire once we're actually applying water to it in a matter of seconds and many times. So think about the last fire that you went to. Knockdown in many cases happened in 15 to 20 seconds on these fires. The beautiful thing about using a bigger hand line is we're getting that punch now. And so yes, it's capable of delivering 250 gallons per minute, but we're still getting these massive fires knocked down in the same amount of time, 15 to 20 seconds. And if we were to choose a line size that isn't meeting the volume of fire, all of a sudden we're going to be running out of water even faster without seeing a dramatic impact to the fire. If we choose the bigger line size and apply water as fast as possible, then we're going to get that knockdown, and we're going to achieve it in times that are very reasonable to us. And so the concern isn't necessarily, how long, is it going to be before I run out of water? It's how can I apply this water in the most effective manner? And have I chosen a line size that is able to overwhelm the volume of fire that we have right now? So think about your fireground tempo. Think about, how long is it going to be to the second due? arrives. That's important. A lot of fire departments, what they're doing is they're stacking up the first and second pumpers, and they're letting even a third arriving apparatus to achieve their water supply. And by stacking up those two, so we're no longer talking about 750 gallons of water. We're now talking about 1,500 gallons of water in the first 2 to 3 minutes. And we've now doubled our capability with our tank capacity just simply by linking the two apparatus together with, let's say, a 3-inch line, one apparatus sending their water to the next. And this has just been confirmed through a lot of the studies recently done by UL, FSRI. And I would encourage you guys to look at these studies. The fire attack studies in single family and multifamily dwellings have confirmed that we're getting complete knockdown with most of the time less than 100 gallons of water usage. And if you watch these videos, you'll see like these are large volumes of fire that they are replicating due to real life scenarios that they're trying to present to these scientists. And still the overall water usage is so much less than you would first be led to believe is necessary. So it's how we apply our water. It's not how much water we're carrying on our apparatus that's really going to matter.
So I asked Bill Adams, as I mentioned, and Ricky Riley in that Viewpoints article about this very question. Is there any reason to make a wholesale switch from 1 3/4 as your primary attack line to the 2-inch or the 2 1/4 inch?
I would say absolutely not. I think we should keep the two hand line sizes and use them when appropriate. The big thing there is having a big variance in flow between the two, because it wouldn't make sense for me to have an 1 3/4 line that's flowing in 185 gallons per minute and a 2-inch line right next to it flowing 210 gallons per minute and expecting them to do very much different. Okay, so I like having hand line sizes with different flows and a variance between the two, so that when appropriate, you pull the small line for maneuverability, for speed, for those scenarios where, we're going to have one engine company on scene with 3 people for 3 minutes by themselves. Yeah, that smaller attack line is going to be phenomenal when we're putting out, 1 to 2 rooms of fire. To ask them to take a, 2 1/4 line or a 2.5 inch line inside because that is their smallest option and accomplish the same things, it's going to be unsuccessful when we do that. But having that line available to the same firefighters when it's appropriate, when they encounter that large volume of fire, or when they have a scenario where they're dealing with the needed friction loss benefits of the bigger lines, having that available to them is also excellent. And one of the things that really solidified this for me is I taught a couple of years back at a department in Kentucky where they chose to go with a 2-inch line, paired it with a combination nozzle with a stem that did, I believe it was 250 gallons per minute, 75 PSI. On paper, that sounds fantastic. Having a high target flow sounds fantastic. Having a line that doesn't weigh very much in terms of water weight sounds fantastic. But as soon as we open up that line, the construction of that 2-inch line just was not able to support the overall weight of that nozzle. It's built differently than the 2.5-inch line that they also had on that apparatus. And so when you open up that line, it had what many people will refer to as nozzle whip or hose whip, where it was really easy to lose control of that line because the weight of that nozzle would just throw the hose line all over the place. It was a scenario where they just did not pair the nozzle with the hose line correctly. And that was their smallest hose line size. Therefore, they were going to have issues every single time a line came off of that apparatus. Now, if we can have a smaller hose line for those scenarios where it's 1, 2, maybe even 3 bedrooms of fire, speed is of the essence and limited manpower in those first couple of minutes, that's phenomenal. Having a hose line size ready for those bigger fires, that's also phenomenal. And let's keep the two separate.
Okay, well that pretty much covers all the questions that I had for you. Do you have any general comments or general or takeaways that you'd like the audience to walk away with today regarding these larger hand lines? Sorry.
Yeah, big thing is be comfortable with the equipment that you have. Right? I'm not asking you to go out and spend thousands and thousands of dollars to replace, all of this equipment. I'm not asking you to, spend $1 million on a brand new fire apparatus because of whatever spec you currently have. Be good at what you have. And that means pulling off your multiple sizes of hand lines, being comfortable when the situation comes up to pull your bigger hand lines that you probably already have. Be comfortable with smaller hand lines that you already have. The reality is if we spend more time training with our bigger hand lines, the small hand line stuff takes care of itself. If we can dial in the technique and we can dial in our attack package with our bigger line operations, small line operations just become almost an afterthought because it's so easy to handle our smaller hand lines. So I would encourage you, especially in your drills, be willing to pull off the bigger hand lines, figure out the techniques. And I mean, there's subject matter experts all over the country teaching every single weekend on big line operations. Please reach out to these people if you just have further questions or you feel like you don't have the ability, because I promise you, it doesn't matter, male, female, large, small, one person should be capable of handling the nozzle. And then the more people that we add on to the system to make this thing maneuverable, the better. But one company is more than capable of using the equipment that they already have. So reach out to those around you. The internet is full of resources, so please use those. There's no excuse at this point. The knowledge is there. Just please seek it out.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you again, Jonathan, for joining me today. If you have listened to this or watched this and you have any questions for Jonathan about these larger hand lines, reach out to me at chris.mccloon, Chris.McCloon at clarionevents.com. It's chris.mccloon, capital, or not capital, that's only if you're spelling that, MCLOONE at clarionevents.com. Also, if you have a topic you'd like us to cover in our podcast series, please let me know. Again, chris.mccloon at clarionevents.com. Let us know. We have a plethora of industry experts, the subject matter experts that Jonathan just mentioned. So if there's a topic you want to see covered, we can definitely cover that for you. So again, my thanks to Jonathan today. He also did do, as I mentioned in the beginning, a webcast for us a couple months ago. It's available on demand. So go to fireapparatusmagazine.com/webcasts. And you will see you'll see our list of webcasts, and you'll be able to register for that. For our other podcasts, go to fireapparatusmagazine.com/podcasts, and all of the podcasts we've done to date will be there. We've covered the apparatus purchasing environment right now, fleet maintenance, NFPA 1900. That's coming up in January. So take a look at those as well. So again, this has been Chris McCloon with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Have a good one and stay safe. The Fire Store, equipping protectors with passion. Every decision the Fire Store makes as a company is about its customers. As the holiday season has quickly approached, explore a wide selection of unique and practical gifts at the Fire Store's Gift Center. Find the perfect presents for firefighters, EMTs, and first responders today. The Fire Store's goal is to get you the gear you need when you need it at prices you can afford. Visit thefirestore.com for everything but the truck and shop its family of brands including Streamlight, MSA, Lion, FLIR, and more.